In this video, I'll show you how to knit a beginner scarf in any yarn weight. A scarf is the perfect beginner project to get your hands in the practice of knitting, and you also get a cute scarf at the end of it. This scarf is knit in garter stitch, which is a super classic, textural, and playful stitch. If you're absolutely brand spanking new to knitting, then please check out my how to knit video, which goes through the steps of knitting in a lot of detail. In this video, I won't do as many repetitions on the basic steps because that's already been covered in that video. So if you're comfortable with the basics of knitting and you want to know how much yarn you need to knit a scarf, how many stitches to cast on, how to make the edges look pretty and neat, how to figure out when your scarf is long enough to cast off, or how to join a new ball of yarn, then this video is for you. For this exact scarf, I used 4 balls of Debbie Bliss Super Chunky Merino. 4 balls equals 350 yards. This is a super chunky weight, soft and plush merino wool yarn. Link to this and all materials in the description. I'm also using a pair of 10mm bamboo needles, a tapestry needle, a tape measure, and a pair of scissors. How much yarn do I need? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on the yarn weight you're using, it depends on the length and width of the scarf, it just depends. But because we all like concrete answers, here is a cheat sheet that estimates how much yarn you'll need on average depending on the yarn weight. So as a rule of thumb, the thinner the yarn, the more you'll need, the thicker the yarn, the less you'll need. But of course, if you knit a really wide or long scarf, then you'll need more yarn. But this is a good starting point. So the next question is, how many stitches should you cast on? Generally, a scarf for an adult is about 8 to 10 inches wide. So I'm just gonna eyeball the width of my scarf just by casting on. So if you don't know how to cast on, then please check out my how to knit video where I go through how to cast on in a lot of detail. So I've gone ahead and made a knot and just put that onto one of my needles, and I've left about like 2 feet of yarn. Okay, so we'll just do a quick little refresher. So I've got my yarn up front here and the yarn that's attached to my ball of yarn in the back of the needle. So now I'm going to use my left hand and just go underneath the yarn here. This is just my loose yarn, okay? And I'm gonna do a thumbs up, and I'm gonna go, using my thumb, I'm gonna go behind that yarn and just swing it around up front, hook the yarn onto my thumb, touch the thumb with my needle, go into the loop around my thumb. Then I'm just going to grab the needle with my left hand. And with this strand of yarn, which is attached to the ball of yarn, I'm going to wrap it around the needle from the back to the front, just like this. And then with the loop around my thumb, I'm going to drag it over the needle and then drop everything off, pull down on the yarn up front, and then pull down on both strands of yarn. And that is my cast on. All right, so I'll do that again. I forgot to mention the first time that we're gonna use our index finger of our right hand to just clamp down on the stitches so that they're not like moving all over the needle. Okay, so right finger clamps down on the stitch, and then my left hand goes underneath the strand of yarn, grabs it. With the thumb, I'm gonna go behind, loop it around, and with my needle, I'm going to touch my thumb, go into the loop that my thumb has made, hold on to everything, and then with the yarn that's attached to the ball, I'm going to go behind the needle and then around, wrapping it around the needle. With the loop around my thumb, I'm going to just drag it over the needle like this, and then pull down on the front yarn, pull down on the back yarn, okay? And that is my cast on. So I'll do that a couple more times. Left hand goes underneath the yarn, up front, thumbs up, thumb goes behind the strand of yarn, then to the front. We've hooked the yarn, the needle touches the thumb, goes into the loop that the thumb has made. Then I'm gonna grab the yarn that's attached to my ball of yarn, wrap it around the needle from the back to the front. Then the loop around my thumb goes over the needle and drops it right off the back. Then I'm going to grab the yarn up front, pull down on both strands of yarn. Okay? Couple more times. The index finger is holding down onto these stitches. The left hand goes underneath the yarn up front, grabs the yarn, makes a thumbs up. The thumb goes behind the yarn and then up to the front. Now we've looped the yarn around, needle touches the thumb, goes into the loop that the thumb has made. Then we grab the needle, grab the yarn attached to our ball of yarn, go behind the needle, okay, behind the needle, and then up front around the needle, pull it down. The loop around the thumb goes over the needle, and then we drop it off, pull down on the front, pull down on the back, tighten up that stitch, okay? And these are our cast on stitches. All right, so I'm gonna just continue doing this, casting on stitches onto my needle until the width of the stitches is like a little bit less than 8 inches. So I've cast on a bunch of stitches, 22 to be exact, and I'm just gonna measure the width of the cast on at this point. So it measures 4 inches, which is much less than the 8 inches that we want our final scarf to be. However, when you knit into these stitches, they will spread out a lot, like considerably. So what I'm going to do is just spread out my cast on stitches, and this will give us a slightly better idea of how wide our scarf is going to be. So I'm going to take my measuring tape out again, and this now measures 6 inches. And just by looking at that, I think that is going to give me the 8 inches that I need. When you knit into the cast on stitches, even when they're spread out like this, they will continue to widen. I'm not going to cast on any more stitches. I'm just going to trust that the stitches will spread out to roughly 8 inches. So if you want your scarf to be, let's say 8 inches, first spread out your stitches like this, measure it out. If it's roughly 2 inches less than what you want your scarf to be, then you are ready to get started. Our first row of the scarf is really simple. We are just going to knit all of the stitches. Now, if you don't know how to knit, then please check out the How to Knit video where I go through how to knit in lots of detail. But essentially, we're going to hold the needle with all the stitches in our left hand, and in our right hand, we're going to hold the naked needle, the needle that has no stitches on it. And this is assuming that you are right-handed. Okay, so I'm going to take my naked needle and just push it into this first stitch on my left needle from the bottom to the top, just like this, okay? And I'm just gonna hold them like these two needles with my left hand. Now with my right hand, I'm gonna grab the yarn that is attached to my ball of yarn, and I'm gonna wrap it around my right needle from the back to the front, just like that. Okay, let's do it again. Back to the front. And I'm gonna pull it down. Now I'm gonna turn my right needle, sort of lever it up. And now you can kind of just see that loop, right? That I've just looped around my right needle is right here. You can just see the hint of it. And I'm gonna use my right needle to just pick out that loop. There it is. Okay, pick it up, push my needle through, and then drop it off the needle. And that is my first knit stitch. Okay, and I'll do that again to the second stitch right here. I'm going to go into it from the bottom to the top, push it through. Then with my yarn, I'm going to go around the needle from the back to the front like this, wedge it down. And now I'm going to turn my right needle up like this, almost like at a 90-degree angle. And now I can just about make out that loop, right? This loop that I've just made around my needle. When I wedge up the needle, I can just see the hint of it right here, right? So I'm going to use my needle to just pick it out. There it is. Pick it out and drop it off my left needle. And I'll do that again. Go into the next stitch from the bottom to the top, just like that. I'm going to use my yarn and go from the back to the front, wedge the yarn down between the two needles. Then I'll kind of lever up this right needle, and then I can just make out that loop, right, that I've wrapped around my needle. And I'm gonna just slowly pick it up. There it is, right on the tip of my needle, push my needle into that loop, and then drop it off the left needle, and then tighten up the yarn. So we're gonna go into the next stitch from the bottom to the top. And with the yarn, we're going to go from the back to the front, just circling around that right needle, pull the yarn down. And by pulling the yarn down, when I kind of lever up my right needle, I can then see the loop, right? Which is right here that I just made, literally this loop that I just wrapped around my right needle. I can see that, right? Right here. So I'm gonna push my needle in, catch it, and then push it off. Okay, so let's do that again. Needle goes from the bottom to the top, yarn goes from the back to the front, pull it down between those two needles. I'll push my needle up like this so I can just make out that loop. There it is, I can just see it. And I'm gonna use the tip of my needle to just pick it out, push it onto my right needle, and then drop it off my left needle. And just give that a little tug to tighten up the stitch. And let's keep going. Bottom to the top, pushing into the stitch. My yarn goes from the back to the front, pull it down between those two needles, and just kind of move my needle up. Just can make out that little loop. There it is. Pick it out and off the needle, okay? So we're just gonna knit all of the stitches on the left needle in this exact manner, okay? And that is gonna be our first row. I've just got 2 more stitches here. There we go, here's my last stitch. The last stitch is always a little bit finicky, so I'm gonna be really careful there. Wrap it around, pick out that stitch, oof, there we go. Okay, so I've just finished my first row. Now the next row and subsequent rows that you're going to knit are very similar. The only thing we're going to change is we're going to slip the first stitch of the row. And doing this creates a really nice edge to your scarf. We call it a selvage edge. So here's a little comparison of what it looks like without the selvage edge and what it looks like with the selvage edge. So to make a selvage edge is very simple. All you're gonna do is insert your needle, your right needle, into that first stitch, and instead of knitting it, right, wrapping your yarn around and pulling out a stitch, instead of knitting it, we're just going to go right into the stitch and drop it off. That's it, okay? Just drop that stitch onto your right needle, and then you will just knit. Just knit as you've been doing. Knit all the way to the end of the row. And that's all there is to it. Just slip the first stitch and then knit the rest of the stitches. And when you get to the next row, just slip the first stitch and knit the rest. Super simple. And just by doing this one little step, by slipping your first stitch, you will create a beautiful selvage edge on both sides of your scarf. So I'm near the end of my second row. Here's my last stitch, and I'm going to knit into that. There we go. Now I'm going to turn my needle over, and we're going to do the same thing all over again. This first stitch on my left needle, I'm going to insert my needle in, and instead of knitting into it, I'm just going to drop it off onto the right needle. And I'll give the yarn a little tug to tighten it up, and then I'll move on to my next stitch, insert my needle in, and just continue knitting, right? That's all there is to making that selvage edge. Slip the first stitch of the row and knit. And when you get to the next row, slip the first stitch and knit. So continue knitting in this manner, just slipping the first stitch and knitting the rest of the stitches on the row until your scarf is the length that you like. After knitting about a dozen rows, I want to measure the width again. And, oh, we are exactly at 8 inches, which is what I wanted. That is perfect. So I wanted to illustrate how much the stitches will spread out as you knit. If you're new to knitting, then you might be making some common beginner mistakes, like dropping your stitches or adding in new stitches. I cover these common mistakes in this video, which I'll link below. Check that out to help you make this scarf as mistake-free as possible. So as you're knitting this scarf, you will at some point need to join a new ball of yarn. So I'm going to show you 2 ways to do it. The first join is what I call the knit together join. And basically, when your first ball of yarn is near the end and you've got maybe like, I don't know, 10 inches or so of yarn left, this is when we're going to join our new ball of yarn. So what I'm going to do is just stick my needle into the next stitch. And I'm going to grab my new ball of yarn, which is in my right hand, and I'm just going to drape it over my knitting. so that it's kind of like up here in the front. And then I'm going to hold it together with my old yarn. So I'm going to hold the 2 strands together like this. And then I'm going to just knit into the next stitch and pull out a stitch like that. And you can tell that this next stitch actually has 2 strands of yarn in it. And that's okay. It's actually totally not noticeable in the scarf. So I'm going to continue knitting the next few stitches with these 2 strands of yarn, both the old and the new yarn held together. So here we go. Just wrap the yarn around, pull out a stitch and off. And again, this is going to be my 3rd stitch. And we might as well just do a 4th stitch. Here we go. I've got just a little bit of tail left on the old ball of yarn. And now when I take a look at my knitting, you can see that the old yarn has still been incorporated into these stitches that we knit into, and the new yarn, which is attached to our ball right here, is now attached to our knitting, right? So I can just pick up the new yarn and knit using it into the next stitches, right? And that is how you join a new ball of yarn. So I've just done a couple rows of knitting, and you can see that on the opposite side, you really can't tell that anything is different. Those double strands of yarn are really not that noticeable. So I'm going to turn it over to the back and just kind of pull it, tighten up those stitches. And now I'm going to grab my tapestry needle and thread it up. And we're just going to hide the yarn tails in our knitting and be as inconspicuous as possible. So typically with garter stitch, you can see these little bumps, right, all over the knitting. I basically like to follow the bumps, like the sort of squiggly wave pattern of the bumps. I'll go down one and then up one and then down again, like this, and then up again, and then down. And when I've done this maybe like 5 or 6 times, then I will sort of stretch the knitting a little bit. And I think that looks pretty okay, pretty decent. And then I'll just cut it right off. There we go. Stretch it a little bit more and just sort of camouflage that in the knitting. With this little yarn tail, I'm going to thread it into the stitch first and then draw it down the stitch again. So I think that's pretty nicely camouflaged, and I can snip that off and snip this off even closer. So that is one way to join new yarn into your knitting. So the second method of joining new yarn is called the spit splice. This join only works for animal fibers like wool, alpaca, mohair, etc. It won't work for natural or synthetic fibers like cotton, bamboo, acrylic, or polyester. That's because only animal fibers can be felted together. This is our old yarn that needs to be joined. This is the new yarn. Okay, so we want to join these 2 yarns together, and we're actually going to do that by wetting both pieces of yarn and putting them together, and using the power of friction and heat, we are going to felt the yarns by rolling them together in our hands. I'm going to start by unraveling the strand of yarn on both the old and the new strands. So I'm just going to very gently kind of pick apart the yarn, and I'm going to do that with our new yarn as well. I'm just going to very gently untwist the yarn. We want to join these 2 strands of yarn together, but we don't want this joined area to be really bulky, right? If I'm overlapping 2 strands of yarn, then for sure this area where it's joined will be thicker than this, right? The rest of our yarn. So I want to debulk the yarn. And I'm going to cut off 1 ply of the yarn. Just chop it right off, set it off to the side. Now my yarn only has 2 plies in this area that we're going to join together. So let's do it to the other side as well. To my old yarn, I'll just grab one of the plies and snip it right off. Great. So now I have sort of debulked this section of our yarn. I'm going to take out a glass of water, and we're just going to soak the strand of yarn in the water, both strands. We're just going to get them wet. It does not need to be soaking wet, just wet-ish, okay? And this is going to help us when we are felting our 2 strands of yarn together. I'm going to put the 2 strands and just kind of overlap them like this, And now I'm gonna pick up this overlapped area and literally just start rubbing my palms together, thereby felting these two yarns together. Okay, that's literally what I'm doing. So as you're rubbing your hands together, the friction and the heat will actually felt those two strands of yarn together. And that looks pretty good. I've actually worked myself up into a sweat. So now when I kind of pull the yarn, you can see it has perfectly joined. How amazing. It looks really nice and smooth, and there's some strength to it. I can pull it and it still holds together. And now I can literally just pick up my knitting and just keep on going, right? Just keep on going with the new yarn perfectly joined, and there's no seaming of tail ends involved. It's a very seamless join, which I really like. So those are two ways to join new yarn to your knitting. As your scarf gets longer, try it on in the mirror and see if you like the length. That's really how I gauge when I want to cast off my scarf. I have to try it on and just, see where it falls on me, whether I want to knit it longer or shorter. And just remember that garter stitch, which is the stitch pattern that we're knitting, garter stitch is very stretchy. So as you wear the scarf, it will continue to lengthen. It is in the nature of garter stitch to stretch. My scarf measures 75 inches, so now we're ready to cast off. I did not end up needing to use the whole fourth ball. I used maybe like a third of it or so, but now I have the perfect length and I'm ready to cast off. So if you need a more detailed tutorial on casting off, please check out my how to knit video, which I will link up above and in the description. Basically, when we cast off, it's very simple. We're going to knit 2 stitches. So here we go, I've got 1 stitch and 2 stitches. Now I'm going to take the first stitch and hop it over the second one. So you can use your left needle for this, but I find that for beginners, they're generally more comfortable using their fingers. So I'll show you how this works. I'm just gonna drop my left needle, and with my left hand, I'm just gonna grab this first stitch and drag it over the second. So this is what it looks like. We're gonna bring it over, hop it over that second stitch and off the needle, drop it off, and now we have 1 stitch on our right needle. Great. So now I'm gonna knit a second stitch from the needle. There we go, 2 stitches. Drop that left needle, and now I'm gonna hop this first stitch over the second stitch. Okay, so I'm gonna grab that stitch with my finger and just hop it over this one. And there it is, hop, 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 and then off the needle, okay? And that's all there is to casting off. We're gonna knit another stitch. So there always needs to be 2 stitches on the right needle, so 1 stitch can hop over the second stitch. So I'm gonna grab that first stitch and just hop it over the second one, there it is, and then off the needle entirely, drop it off. Okay, so again, we'll knit 1, because we always need 2 stitches on the right needle. Casting off is a game for 2 stitches. Drag this first stitch over the second stitch and off the needle, and then knit another stitch. There we go, and off the needle, and drag the first stitch over the second stitch. And we'll do that again, knit 1 more stitch so that we have 2 stitches. And if you want to use your left needle, you can do that as well. You can use your left needle to just go into that first stitch like this, just pick it up, drag it over the second stitch and off the needle. Okay, so your left needle is acting like your finger in this situation. It's going, into the first stitch, just dragging it over the second stitch. Okay, but if that is difficult, finicky to do, then just use your finger. Here we go, I'm gonna take the first stitch over the second stitch, and now I've got 1 stitch left on my needle, and I'm going to get out my pair of scissors. I'll leave about like an 8 to 10 inch tail and snip that off. So now we need to put this yarn tail into this stitch to make a knot and basically secure the whole cast off edge. I'm going to show you two ways to end the cast off. So I'm going to grab my tail end here and just wrap it around the needle. Okay, just like this, like from the back to the front, like this. Show you again. Okay, and I'm going to hold it pretty tightly. And now it almost looks like I have a second stitch, right, on my needle, but this is actually the yarn tail looped around the needle. Okay, so I'm going to hold the yarn tail tightly and grab this stitch that is still on my needle and just drag it over the loop that my yarn tail has made, almost like I'm casting off, right? Just drag it over the loop and then off the needle. And now it looks like I have one stitch left, but this is actually the yarn tail. So I'm going to just pull my needle, and by doing that, I'm dragging the yarn tail through the last stitch, and I'm going to pull this tightly. So that's one way to secure the cast off. Now again, I've got one stitch left on my needle, and instead of doing, you know, the loop-de-loop thing with the yarn tail, I'm going to take out my tapestry needle, and I'm going to thread it up with the yarn tail. So with my tapestry needle, I'm literally just going to thread it into the last stitch on my needle, push it in, and drag the yarn tail through. I'm going to take the needle off of the stitch and then just pull tightly on this knot. And now my cast off is also secure. So now we're going to work the finishing touches on our scarf, which involve weaving in these little tail ends here from the cast off, maybe, you know, little tail ends here from when I joined a new ball of yarn, and also the tail end from the cast on. When I'm weaving in ends in garter stitch, I generally like to follow the contours of the garter stitch bumps. So I'm going to go down, let's see, down one bump close to the yarn tail like this, and then I'm going to go up into the next bump, and then I'm going to go down a bump like this and up a bump, down a bump and up a bump. And I'm going to go in maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 times, or when it starts feeling a bit more secure, I'm just going to give this a bit of a tug so it's not too tight. Then I'll just snip it right off, just like that, okay? And that is how I can secure the yarn tails. And I'll do the same on other parts of my scarf. So I've just finished weaving in my ends, and now my scarf is complete and beautiful. Like, oh my gosh. I'm just really glad that it's off the needles and done and so cushy. I love this. So go ahead, wear your scarf out with pride. Tell everyone you know that you made it. Let them admire it, because it is an achievement. So celebrate the scarf, celebrate yourself for actually creating something so amazing. Go out and wear this with pride, and happy knitting. My name is Davina from sheepandstitch.com. Thank you so much for knitting with me, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.